Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into a fascinating story that shows how influence, strategy, and economics can shape global power without a single bullet being fired. The title might sound dramatic, but by the end of this video you will understand how Australia, a nation often seen as distant from the centers of global conflict, played a critical role in shaking Russia's position in the world. This is about sanctions, resources, alliances, and the way soft power can sometimes be stronger than hard military force. When people think about the struggle between Russia and the West, they usually imagine tanks rolling, fighter jets screaming, and soldiers locked in combat. But modern power isn't only about armies. It's about money, resources, and credibility. Australia showed this in a way few expected. With the Ukraine war as the backdrop, Australia managed to strike at Russia where it hurts the most, its economy and its access to global systems. Australia's first and strongest move was through sanctions. After Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, Australia joined its Western allies in implementing some of the toughest sanctions Moscow had ever faced. These weren't just symbolic. They targeted the financial system, banks, oligarchs, and industries that Russia depended on. While Russia thought sanctions from the United States or Europe would sting, it probably underestimated the impact of a resource powerhouse like Australia joining in. Australia is one of the largest producers of natural resources in the world. From coal to gas to critical minerals, its exports reach across continents. Russia itself depends heavily on resource exports to survive. By cutting off Russia's access to Australian markets and leveraging its own supply chains, Australia squeezed Russia's ability to maneuver. Take energy, for example. Australia is a giant in liquefied natural gas. Countries in Asia that could have turned to Russia for energy supplies had strong ties with Australia instead. By standing firm against Russia, Australia helped limit Moscow's opportunities to bypass European bans. It wasn't just about refusing to buy from Russia, it was about offering other nations a stable alternative. Another area where Australia hurt Russia without firing a shot was technology and defense cooperation. For years, Russia relied on imports of high-tech components for industries ranging from aviation to electronics. When Australia joined the coordinated export bans, it closed another door. Even though Australia may not have been Russia's biggest supplier, every cut added pressure. This cumulative effect weakened Russia's ability to replace critical technologies. Australia also took bold action against Russia's oligarchs. The wealthy elite who supported Vladimir Putin's government had assets and investments around the globe. Australian authorities froze accounts, seized properties, and blocked transactions. It sent a clear message: Russian money was not welcome. This wasn't just financial. It hit the image of Russia's elite, who had long seen Western nations as safe havens for their wealth. But perhaps Australia's biggest contribution was diplomatic. For decades, Russia had tried to drive wedges between Western allies. It counted on distance and regional differences to prevent unity. Australia shattered that hope. Despite being geographically far from Europe, it stood shoulder to shoulder with NATO and the EU. The symbolism was powerful. Russia could no longer argue this was just a European issue. The entire democratic world, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, was united. Australia's voice in international forums carried weight. At the United Nations, it consistently condemned Russian aggression. It joined global coalitions that isolated Moscow diplomatically. For a country with a middle-sized population, Australia punched above its weight. Its leadership showed that even nations outside the traditional power centers could shape outcomes on the global stage. Another crucial point is how Australia's actions influenced Asia-Pacific politics. Countries in this region watched carefully. Many of them depend on both Russia and Australia for trade. By taking such a strong stand, Australia set an example. It told its neighbors that economic principles and international law mattered more than cheap deals with Moscow. Some nations followed suit, quietly limiting ties with Russia to avoid isolation. Australia also invested heavily in supporting Ukraine. Military aid, humanitarian support, and reconstruction funds poured in. While some might argue that Australia's contributions were modest compared to the United States, they were significant for a country on the other side of the globe. These efforts gave Ukraine critical resources and demonstrated that Russia couldn't intimidate smaller nations into silence. The role of Australian public opinion shouldn't be underestimated either. Citizens supported strong action against Russia, and politicians responded. This democratic mandate allowed the government to impose sweeping sanctions without hesitation. In contrast, Russia faced growing isolation as even faraway nations aligned against it. Australia's agricultural power also played a role. Russia and Ukraine are both major grain exporters. The war disrupted supplies and threatened food security worldwide. Australia stepped in to fill part of the gap. By boosting its wheat exports, it stabilized markets and reduced Russia's leverage. Countries in Africa and Asia that might have looked to Moscow for grain found alternatives in Australia. That deprived Russia of one of its key bargaining chips. It's important to see that Australia didn't act alone. Its power came from coordination, but that's exactly what made it so devastating for Russia. Sanctions from the United States, the European Union, Japan, Canada, and Australia together closed nearly every door. Even countries that wanted to keep buying from Russia had to think twice. Australia was part of this global wall, and without it, Russia might have found cracks to exploit in the Asia-Pacific. Another element worth noting is critical minerals. The world is moving toward renewable energy, electric vehicles, and advanced technology. Critical minerals like lithium, nickel, and rare earths are essential. Australia is one of the world's biggest suppliers. Russia also produces some of these materials. But when Australia blocked cooperation, it tilted the market. Western companies turned to Australian sources instead of Russian ones, cutting Moscow out of future growth industries. Now, did Australia literally break Russia? Of course, Russia is still standing. But what Australia did was add weight to the pressure that is slowly grinding Russia down. Economies don't collapse overnight. They weaken over time as opportunities dry up, investments vanish, and isolation grows. Australia's decisions contributed to that long-term squeeze. For Russia, the shock was not just about money. It was about perception. Moscow had long considered itself untouchable to nations so far away. Yet here was Australia, a country thousands of kilometers distant, making real moves that hurt. It undermined Russia's narrative that only the West was against it. Instead, it showed that values of sovereignty and peace mattered everywhere. Some analysts argue that Australia's stance was also self-interested. By isolating Russia, it reinforced its own role as a reliable partner for Asia and the Pacific. It deepened ties with the United States and Europe. It also boosted its reputation among developing nations that benefited from its grain and resources. In other words, standing against Russia wasn't just about morality. It was smart strategy, and yet Australia's moves weren't without risks. Russia still has influence. Cyber attacks, disinformation, and diplomatic pushback were all possible, but Australia calculated that the benefits of standing firm outweighed the dangers. It showed confidence in its alliances and resilience. Think about the bigger picture. The conflict in Ukraine wasn't just about territory. It was about rules. Could a powerful state invade its neighbor and get away with it? If the answer was yes, then no small country would feel safe. Australia understood this. Its own history as a mid-sized nation with powerful neighbors shaped its perspective. By defending Ukraine, it was also defending a principle that protects itself. Australia also gained a voice in shaping the future. Its strong stand earned respect in Europe and North America. It also gave it more influence in Asia, where countries balance between great powers. By proving it could act decisively, Australia showed it wasn't just a bystander in global affairs. As months turned into years, the effects of these moves became clearer. Russia's economy slowed. Its industries struggled to replace lost imports. Its global image suffered. None of this came from bombs or bullets fired by Australia. It all came from decisions, policies, and coordination. That is why the phrase "without firing a single shot" resonates so strongly. Of course, critics might say Australia's role was small compared to the United States or the EU. But that misses the point. The power of unity is that every piece matters. If Australia had sat out, Russia would have been able to claim cracks in the coalition. Instead, Australia's involvement showed the world that even faraway nations cared deeply. This story also offers lessons for the future. Power is not only about military size. It's about the ability to mobilize resources, shape alliances, and project values. Australia proved that. In a world where conflicts may increasingly be fought with sanctions, trade, and diplomacy, its role is a case study in modern strategy. Looking ahead, Australia will likely continue to leverage its strengths. Its resources, technology, and diplomacy make it a key player in the Indo-Pacific. Russia, on the other hand, faces the challenge of isolation and decline, and all of this, remember, happened without a single Australian bullet being fired at a Russian soldier. The story of how Australia helped break Russia's grip is a reminder that the world is interconnected. Distance doesn't matter as much anymore. Values, trade, and global stability are shared responsibilities. Australia took that responsibility seriously, and it left Moscow weaker than before. And that is how, without firing a single shot, Australia broke Russia not through war, but through strategy, unity, and resolve.